We're shining the spotlight on the wildest attacker in chess history, Frank Marshall, who starts e4 in the first game against not one but two opponents working together who reply e5. The game enters a Roy Lopez, and after white's bishop b5, black goes for knight f6, hitting the white pawn. White castles, letting black take it, and he follows with d4, trying to open up the center to create a pin on the knight with his rook. Black wisely develops their bishop instead, and white is able to regain the pawn before black castles. Marshall gets his queen into the action right away, where it hits black's knight, who with a couple of options decides to jump to c5. The bishop goes to e3 as white keeps hounding the knight while developing his pieces. It drops to e6 and white develops his final minor piece with knight c3. Now black wants to get his bishop out, but were they to move either of the pawns, then their knights would have one less defender and white would be able to take twice, winning a pawn. So black shifts their queen so that it indirectly defends that square an extra time. Marshall carries on activating all of his pieces as his rook swings over to the center, and black plays b6, opening the square for his bishop. White drops his queen, opening the square for his knight while pressuring the black king side. And after black develops their bishop, he advances his knight to a powerful central post. Black shifts his rook a square, defending his bishop just to avoid any potential tactics along the diagonal. And white drops his bishop to d3, creating a battery that threatens a checkmate on h7. So black plays g6, blunting the diagonal. Marshall's eyes light up as the new dark squared weaknesses on black's king side allow him to jump his knight to f6 with check. This forks the king and the queen, so black is forced to take that knight, and white recaptures with the pawn, who now suffocates black's king. Black counters with knight d4, opening a discovered attack on the queen by the bishop. She slides over to h4, staying involved in the attack. Still, black is able to snatch the knight, damaging white's kingside after he recaptures. Now black shouldn't be quick to take the pawn, since white is threatening bishop to h6, which would win the trapped rook. So going back, black shifts the queen, vacating a safe square, while pressuring white's pawn. Marshall masterfully defends the pawn with his bishop, freeing up his queen to move. Black shifts his king, opening the square for his rook to defend, and white pushes f4, not just defending his bishop, but opening up a lane for his rook to eventually swing over. After black moves his rook defending g7, white quickly lifts his rook to e3, ready to use the new path. Black drops his knight, preemptively defending h7, and white shifts his other rook over, planning to use every single one of his pieces. The thing is, black's position is so cramped, his piece is doing so little, and the king is in such a precarious position that they're completely lost already. They go for c5, not quite seeing the end just yet. But Marshall has calculated the game to its bitter end, as he slides his rook over, putting up immense pressure on black's kingside. Black, blissfully unaware, pushes his pawn again, hitting white's bishop. White lifts his other rook, and at this point checkmate is unstoppable. Black takes the bishop, thinking they're ahead, but unfortunately the game's all over. White has a way to win, and it's absolutely brilliant. Can you find white's checkmate in 3? To find the move, you can notice that black's king has no escape off of the h-file. So white can set up something similar to a back rank checkmate, but on this side of the board. And the move Marshall plays to achieve that is the brilliant queen sacrifice, queen takes h7. At this point, black resigns the game, but were the game to continue, they'd be forced to take the queen, after which white would sacrifice another rook, removing the last of the king's defenders. White, using his final major piece, would checkmate with rook h3. And while that queen sacrifice was unforgettable, Marshall doesn't even wait in the next game, giving 2 full pieces away in the opening as we dive headfirst into a king's gambit. Colonel Morrow accepts the gambit and white develops his knight. Black goes for g4, seemingly hanging on to his pawn, but after white develops his bishop, black pushes again with g5. Marshall doesn't care. He castles, letting black grab the knight, and he recaptures with his queen, immediately bringing her into the action. Black brings his queen out as well, so that were white to capture the f4 pawn, black could trade queens, given he has upped the knight white just sacrificed. But a pawn is nothing, as white pushes his pawn, giving up another one to lure the queen away from the defense of f7. And Marshall proceeds to sacrifice his bishop. The point of this sacrifice is to lure the king out, and were black to take it, then white would follow with d4, hitting the queen, before he would take the pawn on f4, opening up the file aimed at black's king. But honestly, black could and probably should take that piece, the bishop, because with precise play he could defend this position. Instead of taking the bishop, he cautiously decides to shift his king. Marshall still goes for d4, opening up his queenside while sacrificing yet another pawn that black takes with check. White sidesteps his king, and black develops his bishop to h6, so that were white to take on f4, he could start exchanging pieces. White puts his bishop on d2 instead, threatening to go to c3 with the skewer on the queen and rook. So black drops his queen all the way back, hitting white's bishop, who drops to b3. He then develops his knights, and after white plays bishop c3 hitting the queen, black counters with knight e5 blocking while hitting the white queen. Marshall jumps his queen into the center with an attack on the knight, and black defends it with d6 while opening up his bishop. White swings his rook over to have two pieces pinning the d-pawn to the king. This creates the threat of taking on e5, because were black to recapture with the queen, white would be able to take it with his queen, exploiting the pin on that pawn to the king. So black moves his bishop to d7 instead, blocking the pin, and well, Marshall offers up another piece. The plan would be to deflect the bishop off the d-file and then to take the knight. But black doesn't take that bishop, instead moving his bishop to c6, hitting white's queen. And from this point, it's all Frank Marshall. He grabs the bishop on c6, and after black recaptures, he takes the knight, getting the piece back, emerging down only a pawn. He's exploiting the pin on the pawn to the king, and were black to take this with his queen, then white would recapture with the bishop, which would win the trapped rook in the corner. So black instead moves his queen, counterattacking white's rook, which if captured would come with what's close to a back rank checkmate. So white develops his knights, connecting his rooks. Now, there's no way for black to defend his rook in the corner, with white's battery aimed right at it. So black just lifts his king to d7, opening up his other rook, while letting the first one go. And Marshall doesn't even take it. He advances his knight to c4, swarming the black king. Black goes for an attack of his own, with f3 threatening a checkmate. And white sacrifices his rook with check. Black only has two options here, and king c8 can be ruled out immediately because it would be followed by a checkmate in 3 after queen e8, king b7, knight a5 check, and wouldn't matter where the king would go next, queen takes c6 would be checkmate. Back to the game. So black takes with the pawn, allowing Marshall to capture again on d6 with his queen giving check. The king is forced back, and going to e8 would just allow white's rook to swoop in with check, so he goes to c8. White takes on c6, checking again, and king b8 would lead to bishop e5, which would be checkmate. So the king goes to d8. The rook swoops in, and the king dodges. The queen checks again, then the rook, slowly pushing the king towards his bitter end. Next comes knight e5, forking the king and the queen. But the king dodges, and Marshall doesn't even want the queen. Knight g6 opens a discovered check on the king, and after the king dodges to f7, it leaves us with a single white move that checkmates immediately. Can you find the checkmate in one? White's queen, bishop, and rook cover all but 2 of the black king's squares. So Marshall plays knight takes h8 to cover the last 2, delivering checkmate. Now you might be thinking these last 2 opponents were total bums, and this would never work on somebody who knows what he's doing. Like Grandmaster Efim Bogolyubov, who meets Marshall's d4 with knight f6. Marshall continues by developing his knight, and after black's e6, he pins black's knight with his bishop. d5 is followed by e3, with both sides putting pawns in the center. Then black develops his knight, and white strikes with c4, trying to exchange a flank pawn for a central pawn. Black plays c6, and after the exchange, he decides to recapture with the e-pawn to open up his bishop. White develops his knight, and black moves his queen, unpinning her while pinning white's knight to the king, with a plan of piling up on the knight with his other knight. So, white develops his bishop to d3, covering that square, but black jumps his knight there anyway. White's knight is attacked twice, so Marshall defends it, and black grabs the bishop before white recaptures. h6 kicks the knight back, and after black develops his bishop, both sides castle. White plays a3, potentially planning b4, and black preemptively drops his queen. He then swings his rook over to the e-file, and black plays a5, stopping white's queenside pawns from advancing. White continues moving forces towards the king side with his queen, and black moves his knight out of his bishop's way. White centralizes his knight on e5, and black tries to get rid of it with his bishop, but white plays f4, solidifying its post while gaining space on the king side. So black strikes on the other end with c5. Marshall doesn't react to black's pawn break, and instead patiently starts setting things up by dropping his bishop all the way back. After black develops his final minor piece, white slides his queen over, building a battery aimed at h7. The black knight defends at 4 now, so black puts his bishop on the long diagonal. Meanwhile, Marshall's conceived a plan to dislodge that key defensive knight. He starts by freeing up his e-pawn from defending the d-pawn by taking on c5. Black's bishop recaptures, pinning his e-pawn, so he first moves his king out of the way, and after black's next move, rook e8, he is able to push his pawn forward. Now black can and probably should take the pawn, after which white would have been planning to take the bishop first, removing a defender, before exchanging knights on e4, and then possibly rooks too, before having a solid position where he's finally dislodged that knight, and his queen is looking at h7 and c6. Going all the way back, instead of this, black doesn't take the pawn. He moves his bishop to d4, attacking white's knight. This allows Marshall to get an even better attack. He snatches the bishop on c6, vacating the e5 square, and after the recapture, he pushes his pawn forward, completing his plan to dislodge the knight. It jumps to g4, where it still does coordinate with his bishop onto f2. But white is quicker, as his queen dashes to h7 with check. The king sidesteps, and Marshall, in the midst of an attack, plays the quiet g3, giving his king a square to run to. Black's queen jumps to b6, and after white's bishop jumps to f5, cutting off some more squares from the black king, black jumps his knight to f2 with check. Now white's king could dodge, but this would just give black the next move to make a threat. So he just takes the knight, and after black recaptures, now it's white's turn to attack. His queen storms in with check that forces black's king to run out of its shell. He then takes on g7, threatening a deadly check on f6. So black's king starts running. Marshall checks on f6 anyway, and black has two options. King to c7 would just let white take the pawn on f7 with check. So instead, black blocks the check with his rook. Then white plays e6. Now black shouldn't take the pawn on e6 because white would recapture with his rook, getting a second attacker on black's pinned rook with a strong attack to follow. Black also shouldn't take the white rook that's been hanging because white would take on f7 and white would either be getting a new queen or if the king would move, he'll be giving up his rook. So instead of both of these options, black drops his bishop to d4, hitting white's queen. But who needs a queen when you can make another one? Marshall takes on f7, exploiting the pin on the rook to the king, and letting his queen go. Black takes it, and white just gets a new one, while hitting pretty much everything. Black's only move here is king c7, and white takes the rook with check. After the bishop recaptures, he takes the other rook, emerging after all of this up a piece and a pawn. But we know by now that that's not enough for Marshall, as he goes hunting for the king. Now queen c8 check would be a devastating threat here, so the king runs to d6, before white's queen swings to the other end of the board with yet another devastating threat. A random black move here would be followed by knight e4 check, giving the black king only two options. Going back to c7 would be followed by queen c8 checkmate, and taking the knight would be met by queen e5 checkmate. So going back, black doesn't play a random move, he drops his queen back, defending the c8 square. But still, there is a wonderful win for white here. Can you find the checkmate in 5? White's pieces are in prime position, and if he can force black's king forward, then he can also use his pawns to cut him off. Marshall starts things off with the move queen e5 check, and at this point black does a quick calculation before resigning the game. The king's only move here would be king to c5. Then knight a4 is the only move that would stop the black king from going backwards, with only 2 options. King to b5 would be met by a checkmate 1 move sooner after queen e2 check, king takes a4, and bishop c2 checkmate. So instead of this, the king might go to c4, after which queen c3 would force him back to b5, bishop d3 would force him to take on a4, and queen c2 would be checkmate. And if one grandmaster is not enough, then let's see how Grandmaster David Janowski fares as Marshall with the black pieces takes him into a Petrov's defense. This lets white take the pawn, but after black's d6 kicking the knight back, black is able to regain the pawn. White pushes his pawn 2 squares, getting more control over the center, and then so does black. Both sides develop their bishops, but after white plays an explosive c4, black checks with bishop b4, since white is no longer able to block with the pawn. Now white could block with his knight, but this would put him into a pin where black's knight puts immense pressure on it, and queen e7 check could be annoying. So white decides instead to just sidestep his king to f1. Marshall castles, and white takes the pawn, removing the defender of the knight. Black has to recapture with the queen to defend his knight, and white plays queen c2, adding an attacker. Black defends while centralizing his rook, and white keeps the pressure coming with knight c3. This also attacks the queen, so black has to take the knight, and white recaptures with the pawn. A normal move here would probably be to drop the bishop that's under attack. But this is Frank freaking Marshall, and he takes the knight with his queen. A brilliant queen sacrifice that, were it to be accepted, would result in a checkmate in 3 starting with bishop h3 check. The rook cuts off the king's escape, so he'd be forced to g1, then rook e1 check would force white to block with the bishop and black would take it with checkmate. Back to the game. White just lost the knight and he can't take the queen, so he takes the bishop back instead. Marshall continues development, leaving his queen there like a maniac, and white plays bishop b2, now threatening the queen because his rook protects the back rank. But black counters with knight takes b4, hitting both the queen and the bishop for a second time, and white's in some serious trouble. He takes on h7 with check, and after the king moves, he takes black's queen. Black inserts a check of his own with his bishop, and after white's king moves, black regains the queen before white takes back with his bishop, going up what seems to be a piece. But a piece is no problem for Marshall, as his rook leaps to the second rank, hitting the bishop. White defends with the rook, and black centralizes his other rook. White moves his other bishop out of the black rook's way in order to free up his first bishop to move, and black pulls out another marvelous move, rook 8 to e3. Were white to take that, then black's rook to g2 check would set up a windmillish tactic, after which black would pretty much win all of white's pieces. So, going back here, white doesn't take the rook, instead saving his bishop that's under attack. And black grabs the pawn on f3, setting up his final unstoppable combination. White plays bishop d1, thinking he's about to win some material back, but unfortunately for him, black has a way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 4? To find the move, you can notice that a rook on the g-file would be checkmate. But there's only one good way to get the rook on the g-file that actually works. It can't be this rook, because were it to move, white would take on f3, and after black would check with rook g6, white would just be able to drop his bishop back to block. In this case, even though black might get a discovered check, white would just be up too much material. So going back, we know it has to be the other rook, but there's only one square that works. Going to f4 wouldn't work because white would just take the rook and then the bishop would defend the square. Going to f5 wouldn't work because of white's rook c5 covering the g5 square. So the only move that works and the one that Marshall plays is rook f6, and white resigns. There's only one good way here for white to stop rook g6, and it would be bishop c2 covering that square. And this might look like it saves the game, but black would just take the bishop. And then he'd be threatening to capture the white rook with checkmate. And he's also still threatening rook g6. There's nothing white would be able to do. He might be able to try to delay things while protecting his bishop, but black would play rook g6 and then take that with checkmate. So that makes 4 games that Marshall wins with tremendous tactical acumen. And Lucien Didier starts game number 5 with e5. Marshall with the black pieces again plays a Petrov's defense. After white develops his knight, black develops his bishop attacking it. White's bishop c4 is followed by castling and d3 opening up the white queenside. Then black strikes with d5. White doesn't have much choice here because the bishop's under attack and black's threatening to play d4 piling up on the pinned knight. So he takes the pawn, and after the knight recaptures adding an attacker to white's knight, white develops his bishop to d2 while breaking the pin. Marshall's knight hops to f4 hitting the g2 pawn, prompting white to castle to defend. Then the bishop swoops in creating an irritating pin on the other white knight. h3 kicks the bishop back for a moment, and white follows with king h2, hinting at a potential kingside expansion. After black develops his final minor piece, white goes ahead breaking the pin on his knight. White follows by dropping his other knight, trying to get rid of black's advanced knight. But black lets him have it. He drops his bishop, peering at the enemy king, and white takes the knight before black recaptures. White follows with rook h1, anticipating an opening of the kingside. And maybe white was planning on breaking things open himself. But no, Marshall initiates it with h5. White moves his king out of the rook's way, and black jumps his knight forward. He's trying to get rid of white's knight to move it out of his pawn's way so that he could push his pawn forward. White doesn't want that, so he takes the knight, and after black recaptures, he jumps his queen to f3, blockading black's pawn. Black jumps his queen forward, peering at the enemy king, who quickly sidesteps out of the way. Then he shifts his rook to the open e-file, and white plays c6, preparing a counterattack in the center. Marshall activates his last piece, getting ready to kickstart his attack. Meanwhile, white shifts his rook a square, indirectly hitting black's queen. There's no real threat yet, since pawn takes h5 would just be met by the queen recapturing. So black plays c6, opening up an escape for his bishop in anticipation of white's next move, d4 hitting it. The black bishop drops to c7, staying on its dangerous diagonal, while staying out of the way of its own rooks. Then white takes the pawn on h5, opening up an attack on the queen, who recaptures the pawn. Now white absolutely should exchange queens here, but thinking he's the one with the safer king with his rook on the open g-file, decides to not exchange queens, dropping it, ready to build up an attack. But oh, what a mistake that is. Marshall fires out f3, not only hitting the queen, but locking up white's king. White jumps his queen to g4, now realizing how badly he messed up, but it's too late. Black's not going to exchange queens. Queen to d5. What an amazing move that is. Trying to deflect the bishop away from the defensive... Wait, I won't spoil anything. White doesn't take the queen because it would be a big mistake. So he plays b3, defending his bishop. But to be honest, this position was already hopeless. In this case, black has an immediate and beautiful winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 2? To find the move, you can notice that the white king is completely trapped by the black rook and pawn. So a move like bishop to d3 would be checkmate if not for white's bishop, and that was why Marshall was trying to deflect it away earlier. Well, in this case, he doesn't need to deflect it anymore, because he can just play a different move. Queen takes c4, getting rid of it altogether, with a check. This forces white to capture the queen because there's no other move, and Marshall finishes the game up with bishop d3 checkmate. and while that attack took around 20 moves to get going, this next game's attack happens right out of the opening with Grandmaster Amos Byrne meeting Marshall's d4 with knight f6. Knight f3 developing is followed by d6, and after bishop f4, black brings out his other knight. White's e3 opens his king bishop, and black goes for g6, trying to create a very solid construction. Black's bishop g7 prepares to castle, and after white's knight b to d7, he goes ahead and castles. But the second the black king is committed to the king side, Marshall strikes. h4. Black carries on with rook e8, and out comes h5. Black, thinking he could just take the pawn, does so. And bang, rook takes h5. That's a full piece, so black doesn't have much choice but to accept white's exchange sacrifice. And the whole point of this sacrifice comes to light after the next sacrifice, bishop takes h7. Now black absolutely should not accept this one. The king here should go to f8, where he's quite safe, and the game would actually be fairly equal, despite white being down in exchange. He has compensation in the form of a lead in development. But instead of this, black bites the bullet and grabs the bishop, and he falls right into Marshall's hands. White jumps his knight to g5 with check, and if the king went back, then white would take on h5, threatening both the f7 pawn and the h7 pawn. A move like knight f6 trying to defend would be followed by queen takes f7, pushing the king to h8 and queenside castling so that the rook could slide over to the h-file, and there just would not be a way to stop this impending checkmate. Back to the game. So instead, black advances his king forward to defend the h-pawn. Marshall advances his other knight closer to the attack, and black tries e5, trying to open up his pieces, but it's too late. Knight h4 check, which couldn't have been stopped, comes. The king shifts over, and then knight h7 check. The king should not go to e6 here, because d5, king e7, and knight f5 would be checkmate. So going back, the king goes to e7. Knight f5 pushes him right back to e6, and then white takes the bishop with check. The king should not move forward here, because c4 would come, giving black 3 options, none of which are any good. Taking the pawn would be met by queen b3 checkmate. Moving forward would be met by f3 checkmate. And going to c6 would see queen a5 followed by queen b5 checkmate. So, instead of all of these, black drops his king a square. Still, white has a way to win the game. It will just take a little bit longer. Can you find the checkmate in 6? White has a way to slowly and steadily push the black king forward, where surrounded by white's army, he will inevitably get checkmated. The move Marshall starts with is knight f5 check. This forces the king to e6, after which d5 sacrifices a piece. But that's okay, because white has more than enough of those. Queen h5 check comes next, pushing the king to e4. And then the final move of the game, queenside castle, using the rook to cut off the black king. At this point, black resigns. And it's actually very important that white castles here, because were he to have just moved the rook, then black might have been able to delay things an extra move with queen h4 pinning the f-pawn. But instead, by castling, white is threatening to play f3 checkmate, and queen h4 doesn't pin the pawn. Black would have to play queen j5 to give his king the f5 square, but after white would take it, f3 would be unstoppable, and no matter what, checkmate would come next. And despite getting trampled in this game, Amos Byrne tries again, and this time Frank Marshall leads us into an Italian game. Black also moves his bishop to c5, and white plays c6, preparing a central advance. After black develops his knight, hitting the e4 pawn, white lets it go as he strikes with d4, hitting black's bishop. Black takes the pawn, and white takes back before the bishop moves to b4 with check. The king shifts over, and black wins the pawn. Marshall pushes forward with d5, kicking the other knight back. This removes the defender of d4, allowing white to jump his queen up, hitting the knight and the g7 pawn. Black is able to save both, with knight f6 blocking the diagonal, and white adds an attacker on the knight while developing his bishop. Black moves his other knight up, away, opening up his queen's defense of the knight, and white develops his final minor piece before h6 is played, asking the question to white's bishop. Marshall counters with rook e1 check. And if white were to try to block with the bishop, then that bishop would be pinned, and white would be able to take on f6, potentially winning some material. So black just sidesteps his king out of the check. White then drops his bishop, opening up an attack on black's bishop, who drops to e7, still breaking the pin on his knight. Then white grabs the knight on g6, removing a key defender from black's kingside. In exchange, black grabs the bishop on g5. Now Marshall could retreat his bishop, but he finds an even better move, and one more suited to his style. Knight e5, sacrificing that bishop. Now black doesn't have to take it, but white is threatening to take on f7, which would be a pretty nasty fork. So black decides to take it. White recaptures with the knight, giving a fork that hits the king and the bishop. And after the king dodges, white takes the bishop with his rook. Black does get the knight in exchange, but his king has pursued pretty far up there, and he's about to meet his end. Marshall drops his queen to d3, checking the king while stopping him from backing up. The king only has a couple of options. Going to h5 would lose quickly after rook takes g7, which would threaten queen h3 checkmate. Black would have a couple of ways to stop that, g4 or d6 opening up the bishop, but white would play queen g6 instead in either case, followed by queen g5 checkmate. So going back, the king instead goes to h6. White pushes h4, trying to open up the h-file, which, if allowed, would be devastating. So black pushes g4, and white keeps his pawn going, confining black's king to its final two squares, while threatening queen g6 checkmate. So black has no choice but to take the pawn with his knight. And here, there is only one move that forces checkmate for white. Can you find it? Now white is down a full bishop here, and if he's too slow, black might have time to get his pieces out and consolidate his position. His rook is also hanging, so whatever move white plays has to be forceful. For example, queen e3 is a check, but after g5, there isn't another good check, nor a good way for white to threaten checkmate, and black could always give up his queen for the rook to stop a potential checkmate. So going back, the winning move, and the one that Marshall plays, is queen f5. This threatens a checkmate with queen takes h5, and while there is a way to temporarily stop that, there isn't a way to stop the eventual checkmate, so black resigns. He could try g6, defending his knight, but black would play the brilliant sacrifice, rook takes h5, forcing black to recapture with the pawn, after which queen f6 would be checkmate. And the checkmate so brilliant that Amos Byrne had to come back for a third time, and Marshall leads him into a queen's gambit, which he declines with d6. White develops his knight, and so does black before white pins it to the queen with bishop g4. Black breaks the pin with bishop e7, and after white's e3 opening up his king's side, black castles. White develops his knight, and black's b6 looks to put his bishop on the long diagonal. Both sides proceed to develop their second bishops before white takes the center and black recaptures. Marshall then takes the knight on f6, removing a defender from the king side, and after black recaptures, he hauls out h4. Black, probably wanting to solidify his king side and give a square to his bishop, plays g6, but this only prompts white to keep pushing. Black shifts his rook over a square, and white grabs the pawn on g6 before black recaptures. Then white puts his queen on c2, building a battery aimed at g6. Now black's best move here is king to g7, defending his pawns. But instead, he drops his bishop back to g7. And boom! Marshall bursts out with bishop takes g6. Now black shouldn't take the bishop back, but he just lost the pawn, and his king side is completely open. So he takes the bishop, and white recaptures with his queen, ready to hunt down black's naked king. Black races to get his knight out to defend his king side, and white jumps in with knight to g5, threatening a checkmate of queen f7. Now the only way for black to stop this would be to give up his queen for the knight, but that would be completely losing. Instead, he tries queen f6, And here you can put yourself in Marshall's shoes to find the win. Can you find the checkmate in 2? To find the move, you can notice that were black's king on h8, then queen h7 would be checkmate. Well, white has a way to force him there, and the move Marshall plays is the remarkable rook sacrifice, rook h8 check. The bishop is pinned, and the black king has no escape, so he's forced to take the rook, and queen h7 is checkmate. That leaves Amos Byrne 0-3 to Frank Marshall. So, let's see if a different grandmaster can do better against his queen's gambit. Akiba Rubinstein also declines it, but after knight c3 he strikes with c5. White takes on d5, giving black a weak pawn on d5 after he recaptures, since it can't be defended by other pawns. Then he develops his second knight. Black also brings out his knight, and white pins it with his bishop to the queen, before black unpins it with bishop e7. Then, since black's bishop has already moved, white takes on c5, giving black the isolated pawn, and telling black he needs to clumsily move his bishop a second time if he wanted to recapture. For now, he stubbornly carries on development with bishop e6. Marshall slides his rook over to c1 on what could soon become an open c-file. And after black castles, he snatches the knight on f6, removing a key defender from black's kingside. Black recaptures and white plays e3, opening up his kingside, before black swoops in with queen a5, looking to regain the c-pawn. White plays a3, a preparatory move, so that after black develops his knight, he can safely deploy his bishop without fearing the knight coming to hunt down the bishop. Then black finally grabs the pawn on c5. And you might be thinking, now's the time for Marshall to castle. But it's been 8 games now, so you really should know better. h4, a ferocious move looking to build an attack on the king side. Black drops his queen back, building a battery aimed towards that pawn. And black jumps his knight to g5, coordinating with his bishop on the h-pawn. Black plays h6, saving the pawn while kicking the knight, who grabs the bishop. Now black could take back with the queen, but then white would be able to grab the pawn on d5, and black's queen wouldn't be able to take back because of a discovered check tactic, winning the queen. So, going back, black takes with the pawn. And this is exactly what Marshall wanted, a weakening of the light squares near the king. He drops his bishop back, a quiet but deadly move, preparing to build a brutal battery. Black, on the other hand, uses his own battery to take on h4. This also coordinates with the rook to create an attack on f2, so white plays g3. And I have to say it's time Marshall gets a taste of his own medicine, and black plays bishop takes g3. White accepts the sacrifice, and after black's queen g5, threatening not 1 but 2 pawns, each with a check, things are about to get chaotic. Marshall fearlessly lifts his queen to d3, threatening a devastating check on h7. But black is able to take on g3 with a check of his own. No problem, white says, as he dodges his king to d2. Another check with rook f2, which white calmly blocks with his knight. And there's no more checks. Black jumps his knight to e5, threatening both the queen and a couple more checks. But now it's Marshall's turn. Queen h7 check. Now black absolutely must play king to f8 here. White would still be better after queen h8 skewering and then winning the rook. But then black could start making threats of his own. For example, with rook takes e2 and queen g2 check. Going back, instead of this, black moves his king to f7, a fatal mistake. This is because white can now jump his rook to c7 with check. The king cannot go backwards because of an ensuing checkmate after queen g8, which even if the rook were to block, white would take on e6 and then checkmate on e7. So again, instead of that, black moves his king forward to f6. But even then, white has a way to end the game. Can you find the checkmate in 5? To find the move, you need to notice 2 things. Thanks to white's bishops that cuts off these 2 squares, queen e7 would be checkmate. Also, queen takes g7 would be checkmate if black's queen were not defending that square. While Marshall notices a way to exploit these 2 things with the brilliant sacrifice, rook takes h6 check. Black resigns because there's just no way out. Taking the rook is out of the question because of queen e7 checkmate. Blocking with the knight and moving the king to g5 are similar because they both cut off the queen's defense of g7, after which white would take it with check, forcing the knight to block, and then queen takes g6 would be checkmate. Going back, this leaves us with the longest checkmating combination, black blocking with the queen. White would take that, and after the knight would recapture, white would take that too, forcing the king to the center. Queen g3 check would leave black with two final options. Blocking with the rook would be no good because white would take it with checkmate, and the other one, moving the king to f6, at which point we would see the original queen takes g7 checkmate. Marshall's been making all these grandmasters look like amateurs, and he's about to make this amateur look like a baby in just 13 moves as he meets the Sicilian with b4, the wing gambit. The idea is to divert black's pawn away from d4 so that he can build up a big center, but instead of taking the pawn, black plays e6. Thing is, after white grabs the pawn and black recaptures with the bishop, white is still able to play d4, but this time with a tempo. The bishop drops back, keeping an eye on the center, and white carries on development. Black strikes with d5, but white just pushes his pawn, gaining substantial space, especially on the king side. Black develops his knight, building up pressure on white's center, and white just plays c3, solidifying it, and with white's suffocating e5 pawn, black is stuck developing his knight to a more passive square on e7. Marshall, on the other hand, plays a Greek move, bishop d3, weaving a deadly trap, one that black falls right into after he castles. Bishop takes h7 comes next. Now black doesn't have to take it, but white just won a valuable kingside pawn, and either way his follow-up plan would be similar. So black takes the bishop, and white jumps his knight to g5. Now let's quickly look at what would happen were black to play the best move, king to g6. Here there's still a game ahead of us, but white would be the side for choice after a move like h4. His queen would be planning to swoop in next, so black might play f6 trying to kick the knight away, after which white could play queen d3, which would pretty much force black to either block with the pawn or the knight, and white would follow with h5 in either case, forcing the king to h6, and knight f7 would be a double check. Don't forget about the bishop. That would win the queen. Back to the game. So black drops his king to g8 instead, and it's time for Marshall's favorite activity, king hunting. Queen h5 threatens queen h7 checkmate, so the only saving move is rook to e8. White plays queen h7, pushing the king to f8, and at this point, white has a way to force checkmate, but it's not as easy as you might think. Can you find the one and only move that wins immediately? Now were white to hastily play queen h8, then black would just block it with the knight. And don't get me wrong, white would still be better here, but there's a much better move than queen to h8. The one Marshall plays is bishop a3. It's not a check, it's not a capture, but it's a vicious move that pins the knight to the king and threatens an unstoppable checkmate of queen h8. So black resigns because it really is unstoppable. As much as he would try to break the pin with all of his pieces, white would just pick them up one by one before black would run out, and white would inevitably deliver checkmate. A stunning checkmate that would be leading us to our penultimate opponent, Karpinski, who starts e4. Marshall takes us into a Petrov's defense, and white plays d4, and black plays d5, creating chaotic tension in the center. White takes on d5, and black takes on d4. Then white's bishop swoops into b4 with check. Black blocks it with his pawn, and white follows with queen e7 check, which black blocks with his bishop. After white captures on c6, black recaptures with his pawn, hitting the bishop, who backs up, and then black is immediately able to castle. Now white has an idea here to grab the pawn on d4, and then after the queen would recapture, white would be able to take the now hanging bishop. But in this case, black would shift his rook over, winning the queen thanks to the pin to the king. So going back, white sets things up by castling first, and now he's threatening to take the pawn. Marshall swoops his bishop to g4, pinning the knight to stop the capture. But white plays h3, kicking the bishop back, and then g4, breaking the pin. White then grabs the bishop with his bishop first, and after the recapture, he takes the pawn. But even though white just won a pawn, he seriously weakened his kingside. Black grabs the knight while centralizing his queen, and white takes the bishop in return. Black activates his rook with a tempo, pushing the queen all the way back to a3. Then black develops his final minor piece, and white slides his queen over to c3, begging for a queen exchange after realizing that he might be in some trouble. Marshall, of course, declines, and white quickly starts trying to catch up in development. Black drops his queen to e6, potentially preparing a sacrifice on g4, and white shifts his queen, persistently offering exchanges. Black blocks with his knight, and white shifts his rook in line with the enemy queen, whereas black counters with rook a to b8. The white queen dodges, and even though white's rook is lined up with black's queen, there isn't really any good discovered attacks, and don't forget that that rook is actually hanging. So Marshall doesn't react, jumping his knight to f4, threatening the h3 pawn with a check. White backs his bishop up, opening his queen's defense of the pawn, while hitting black's queen with his rook, who's now defended. So black moves his queen to d5, threatening worse, a checkmate on g2. And things are about to get really bad for white. His rook is under attack too, so he is forced to exchange rooks first before grabbing the knight to stop the threat of checkmate. But now his back rank is completely undefended. Marshall swoops in with rook e1 check. The king is forced to h2, and then rook h1 check is next. After king g3, he checks again, and the king can't go back here because of queen h1 checkmate. So instead, the king runs to h4. Knight e5 threatens a devastating check on f3 that would force white to give up his queen for the knight. In this case, knight to d2 would be white's best defense, but it would allow black to win the rook in the corner, and now black would be up material with still a devastating attack incoming. So instead of using knight d2 to stop the threat, white just grabs the knight with his bishop. And now it's your time to shine and spot the win. Can you find the checkmate in 4? To find the move, you can notice that white's king is completely trapped on the edge of the board, except for this one diagonal. While the move Marshall plays to take out those last two squares is queen d8 check, and white resigns. The king has absolutely no escape, and one by one, he would be forced up to give up all of his pieces before an inevitable checkmate. And let me be frank, Marshall's games have probably proved to you by now that he's an absolute madman. But let's just throw one more in here. Philip Coldwell is the last opponent, and we enter an Italian game. After white castles, Marshall plays d6, opening up his queenside, and white's c3 preparing a central advance is followed by bishop g4, creating an irritating pin. White goes for a patient d3, opening up his queenside, and black's h6 limits those white pieces' development squares. Bishop e3 offers an exchange, but black taking would give white an extra central pawn. Also, were black to let white capture his bishop, his pawn structure would get damaged. So black drops his bishop before white develops his final minor piece while defending his other knight. Marshall gets his knight out, and after white moves his queen out of the pin, he snatches white's knight. This frees up the g4 square so that after white takes back, he can jump his knight to g4, adding an attacker to white's bishop. White swings his rook over defending, and then black drops his knight, maneuvering it towards the king side. White's h6 kicks black's knight back, and after queen b3 building a battery aimed at f7, black castles so that his rook defends the pawn. Then white exchanges bishops before breaking with d4. Marshall maintains the tension, continuing his knight maneuver, and white drops his queen to c2, supporting his center, while indirectly peering at the king side. Black lifts his queen, connecting his rooks, and white's b3 boxes out the enemy knight. But this also weakens the h3 pawn, so black quickly shifts his queen over, hitting h3. White lifts his king defending, so black moves his queen to c6, menacingly staring at him. White slides his queen over to e2, threatening bishop to b5, which would actually trap black's queen. So black drops his queen right back to d7, and white shifts his rook to d1, preparing to capture on e5 and open up the d file towards black's queen. And although this position looks similar to the one we just had a couple moves ago, in this case there's a slight difference, and that's the position of white's king and queen. Marshall jumps his knight to f5, ready to exploit it, jumping into f4 with a fork, and were that knight to get captured, black would just recapture it with the other knight. So the best defense here for white would be just to move his king or queen out of the fork. But white decides to instead take on e5, counterattacking black's queen. And it's all downhill from here. Marshall jumps in with knight f4, and after it's captured, he plays knight f4 again. Now white's only decent move here is king to g1, after which black would take the queen with check before taking the knight back, saving his queen and having a completely winning position. So instead of this, white doesn't play king g1 and he moves his king to f3 and giving black a brilliant winning combination. Can you find the checkmate in 2? Now let's go back a second. Were the king to have gone back to h1, then the h3 pawn would be hanging, and that's the big idea here. Black would take it with check before checkmating on g2. But in this case, the king goes to f3. And by the way, black's continuation would be the same had the king gone to g3. But the move Marshall plays is queen takes h3 check, letting his knight go. And that's because the final move is the aesthetic checkmate, g5.